surrounding whether this is something that can be presented online. If the commission were to support some portions of your request, we could get that in the queue and get it processed through CJI and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. I'm trying to get you money, but in what sequence? And I'm not sure with another meeting until July, we can answer all of the questions surrounding your request. So if one were to apportion this and grant part of it now and the remainder in July after it's been revised, what sequence would you prefer? Does that make sense? Do you understand my question?
Yes, sir. Sergeant Rosales for parole and probation. I understand. And right now, not knowing the availability for them to complete this master trainer course online with us, and the likelihood that they're not going to be able to travel anytime soon to complete that training, then yes, I would request for the enhancement portion, the $39,000 for the actual technical enhancements that we can actually begin working on now. That would take priority then.
Okay, so for the commission's benefit, we could set aside a reserve, for example, for the trainer portion, maybe half or maybe 20,000 instead of 36, but revisit that subject in July before it's finally approved. Does that make some sense to you?
Sergeant Rosales for parole and probation. Yes, sir, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for Sergeant Rosales from commission members?
Okay. Christine Jones-Brady.
Yes, ma'am.
Chairman. So if the NDOC staff will also be able to input into it, the NDOC staff will also be given that training, that some of that master training, or just the one person, or how will that work together? How will the PNP and NDOC coordinate with that training?
Sergeant Rosales for parole and probation. Currently, the enhancement feature that NDOC would benefit from would definitely be in the technical aspect, in that we would have one assessment module that both agencies could view and enter assessments for individuals based on their location and type of supervision at that time. So if an individual is getting released from NDOC, the caseworkers would be able to enter the reentry tool, the reentry NRAS for that individual. And then once they've arrived with parole and probation, our staff are able to go into the same assessment system, see what their assessment level, their risk level is at, and then accurately place them. And then NDOC would then be able to also see our assessments if an inmate is revoked on probation and is re-entering prison. Right now with the Master Trainer program, that was focused mostly on parole and probation staff members becoming those Master Trainers. But I know we've worked with Mr. Franklin before. We've been in discussions in regards to case planning training and trying to get everyone, into similar classes. So our staff would be available, and I'm sure would be amenable to train staff at NDOC as well.
Any other questions for Sergeant Rosales? All right, let's move on then to the next sub-award request.
Thank you, Chair. Victoria Gonzalez for the record. So the next request comes from the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, otherwise referred to as POST. The request includes an amount for $32,289 to fund a part-time contracted training specialist for fiscal year 2021. This contracted position is intended to lay the groundwork for a grant manager position POST plans to request in the next biennium. The training specialist responsibilities are geared towards addressing requirements in AB 236, sections 104, 105, and 107. And then we, as I noted, we provided those NRS sections in the chart that we gave to we provided in advance of the meeting. These would include development of standardized training on crisis intervention, which is section 107 of the bill, model policy development to guide law enforcement agencies statewide in meeting the requirements from AB 236, Section 105, and establishment of a peer review panel, grant application and review process, and development of best practice parameters for the behavioral health field response grant program as provided in Section 104 of the bill. Director Sherlock, do you have anything else you would like to add?
Mike Sherlock for the record. No, I think that's a good summary.
So now I'll open up for questions from the commission. For Director Sherlock.
Keith Logan for the record. Director Sherlock, is there any way to trim anything if we could?
Mike Sherlock for the record. Most of the cost applies to the contracted position. I suppose in-state travel could be shaved. We have that at about $4,600, and that was for 3 in-state trips and 1 out-of-state, I believe. I mean, there is some room there. Currently, we can't travel at this point, but some of it could be trimmed.
Keith Logan again. I know that you've got it pretty tight in there. It's just a matter of as you've been through these processes before, trying to determine where we can fit it all in. I appreciate your efforts at trying to get this in there.
Any other questions? This is Chair Hardesty. I do have one question. What is Post doing with respect to the utilization of virtual training or presentations similar to the questions we asked Sergeant Rosales concerning online training from the University of Cincinnati Corrections Institute?
Mike Sherlock for the record, Mr. Chairman. So, as you may or may not know, Post, we do utilize online training pretty extensively, obviously. We have a system called NV eLearn. A lot of our training programs are presented via online, just based on the makeup of our state and person and spread out the state is. So we do utilize that online training quite extensively. When you look at this grant request, we're specifically looking at those sections that Director Gonzalez highlighted, sections 104, 105, 107. Those requirements of Post are fairly specific, although some of it is the development of training, and certainly a lot of that training we would be able to deliver online. That's just a small part of what this bill asks of Post. So
what I was, this is Jeff Hardesty again, what I was curious to know is, and I get the point here, you're, as I understand it, you're trying to develop some of the required training expected in the new state statutes and then convey that to participants. What is not clear to me is why it would be necessary for this part-time position to need travel at all under these conditions.
Mike Sherlock for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we looked at this, looked at what's going around national, thought that it's important both in terms of best practice and looking at what other entities are doing in this field, particularly with behavioral health response teams. We work closely with agencies in Post in California. Some of that they're ahead of us. We just thought it might be, as we develop this, be important to have a firsthand look at best practice of what other entities are doing, and that's why we have that. And even within our own state, we have agencies that have developed programs that would be beneficial for us to look at as we make recommendations statewide.
Then one final question, if I may. Would this position commence July 1? I know that's what's projected, but do you have people that are available? Do you have a trainer, a part-time person, or a contractor that you have in mind? Just how quickly could this begin? If it were available and funded by July 1, would you have somebody who could start July 1?
Mike Sherlock for the record. Yeah, a lot of what we do in terms of subject matter experts and just based on a lot of different considerations, we use contract positions where we can, and we do have a fairly large pool of qualified individuals that we could use.
Okay. And then this is, I said it was just the last question, but I did have one other. It relates to the question I posed to NDOC. This position is going to be part, I guess, of your budget request to the legislature. If that were funded, how would how would that impact this request?
Mike Sherlock for the record again, Mr. Chairman. Again, so as you know, we're just heading into the second year of our biennium. So this position would provide the infrastructure for that permanent position if we're able to get that in the next biennium. So that 1 year period in between this final year of this biennium, part-time position would provide the infrastructure for that full-time position. What amendment would you make to the amount you've requested so that that can be considered by the commission in their deliberations today, if any? Again, I think, Mike Sherlock for the record, I think the only wiggle room, as it were, that we would have would be in that area of travel. And, if we, for instance, cut that in half, we could drop that down to about 20.
To what? I'm sorry, yeah, you cut out at the most important time.
I'm good at that. Mike Sherlock for the record again. So if we cut travel in half, we would drop that request down to 2,300 somewhere, and take that same amount off the top, bringing it to somewhere around $1,250.
Right? Did you get that number?
I've got the travel.
Okay.
So, yeah.
This is Christine Jones Brady. I have a question.
Sure.
I was actually concerned that it might not be enough with the post and the travel. We have some of the rural areas that I don't know whether or not they are able to have, audio visual. Sometimes they don't have as much technology available to them as other areas, especially in the frontier areas. And so I'm concerned that cutting the travel, I would hope that wouldn't, that they would still be able to get to the rural areas, and that's enough time, a part-time position, enough to really get this training out there and solidified and available to as many law enforcement entities as possible.
Mike Sherlock for the record. Thank you for that question. As you may or may not know, we clearly deal with the rurals quite often, adept at dealing with that. In terms of the part-time position for that, we calculate that's about 1,000 hours. We've been pretty successful in that in the past. I think have been pretty responsive to the rurals, working with them, and that's kind of how we came up with it. Now, cutting that travel in half would reduce the physical contact with the rurals to a certain extent, but yeah, we deliver training to the rurals quite often.
Any other questions for Mr. Sherlock? All right, let's turn to the Washoe County District Attorney's presentation.
Thank you, Chair. For the record, Victoria Gonzalez. The last request we have before the commission is from Washoe County District Attorney's Office. The Washoe County District Attorney's Office is requesting $89,386 for an AB 236 implementation coordinator, which would start mid-May and go through to the end of June 2021. This would not be a full-time county employee, but would be brought in through a staffing company. The coordinator would perform three main duties: develop training materials and presentations attendant to the enactment of AB 236 for attorneys, allowing for remote access. It would work with information technology and support staff to make necessary changes to auto-generated documents, such as charging documents, to ensure the documents are updated with changes laid out in AB 236. And would identify data collection related to AB 236 and work with attorneys, support staff, and IT staff to develop methods for collecting data related to recidivism reduction, offense rates, and diversion outcomes. The coordinator would analyze the data and prepare visuals and other written materials, including quarterly reports and an annual report. Ms. Noble, would you like to add anything?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Chair Hardesty and all the members of the commission. Thanks for considering our application. I would just add that I know we are the only, I think, applicant so far that's a county agency. But what we're really envisioning and what is consistent with what we've done over the past is taking a statewide leadership role in developing training modules for prosecutors that are going to be accessible remotely, as we all sort of struggle and to meet the challenges that COVID isolation requires, and as it may routinely require or intermittently require. And so we've done that, and we regularly open up our trainings to prosecutors across the state and our criminal justice partners. That's something we would intend to keep up. And so to the extent that although this is our office requesting assistance with this, in terms of the training aspect, we would intend to share that with the other criminal justice agencies and particularly the rural agencies. Additionally, we use the same, or many of the agencies, prosecutors' offices use the same criminal justice software, Justware. And so one of the things we want to make sure we do in coordination with our IT department is to make sure that communication with the courts is consistent, ensuring accurate data points are met, and that we are developing and tracking effective methods of collecting this data related to criminal justice outcomes. So with that, I would just ask if there were any other questions, but I'm happy to comment.
Are there any questions of Ms. Noble?
I have a question. This is Rochelle speaking. Can you
Go
hear
ahead.
me? Okay. You had mentioned that you use Justware. Are you familiar with what other agencies, like in the rules and the other like law enforcement agencies, are using as for their systems, and whether or not that you have like integrated systems amongst you? I know, like, I believe the Clark County Public Defenders use Justware, but I don't believe the Clark County District Attorneys use it. And I'm just curious if you know if there's like similar systems that those rural areas are using as well.
Thank you for the question, Assemblywoman Nguyen. I think that the Carson City District Attorney's Office, or in fact, I'm fairly certain, Carson City District Attorney's Office, the Douglas County DA's office, I actually think Clark County DA, but I may be wrong about that. And I think even more of our rural jurisdictions, I believe Lyon County, all use Justware. And yeah.
This is Darren Emily. The Clark County District Attorney's Office now uses Justware as well.
Thank you. And so I hope I'm answering your question in that, you know, we're going to be identifying how we want to modify Justware's inquiries and tracking to develop data that we can share with the commission, with others that are specific to 236 and specific to the inquiry as to whether or not, we are getting better outcomes, and that's going to take some time and some creative thinking and some thorough thinking in terms of developing those inquiries. And somebody with a background in perhaps statistics would be helpful to that. I'd also like to throw in, if I may, because I was so happy to hear that there may be additional funding available, especially when we're talking about, for example, criminal justice outcomes and reduction in recidivism rates for the changes that AB 236 makes to eligibility for diversion. 1 year is the period of time we've asked for someone to assist us in doing all this. But I believe that type of change and that type of improvement is probably going to take a bit longer than that in terms of identifying. So if it's possible, we would like to expand our request to a little bit more time than that, 1.5 years or 2 years, if that's something that the commission is willing to consider, and we can certainly submit additional documentation.
Any other questions?
Just keep Logan for the record. Since I've broken record on this, I'm going to ask the same of Washoe County. Is there a way, based on what I see, it's all personnel costs. You guys have done the in-kind for all the office supplies and stuff like that. But is the staffing agency administrative payroll costs, is there any wiggle room or ability to reduce any of that money?
Okay, that is an excellent question for Lori Freilich, our law office manager. And so I'm going to play a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and ask if she could maybe be my lifeline on that question, because that's right in the ken of her expertise.
Good morning. For the record, this is Lori Freilich with the Washoe County DA's office. And I did request 3 estimates from 3 different staffing agencies, and that was the lowest cost. I will say that it does not look likely that we would be able to get somebody hired and on board by the initial date of May 18th. So I figured and recalculated the numbers, and if we did an effective July 1 date, we could reduce our request for 1 year full of funding to $79,040. So that takes it down about $10,000, if that would help in determining the funding allocation.
Keith Logan for the record. Every dollar does count. Thank you.
Any other questions for Ms. Noble or Ms. Freilich? Okay, hearing none, what I'd like to do is take a 10-minute recess, allow people to think about what we've been provided, and then return and deliberate on these requests and decide how we might want to approach them. So let's take a 10-minute recess. This is not a legislative 10-minute recess. This is exactly 10 minutes. It is 11:16. We'll see you at 11:26. Thank you. Okay, let's call him. Ready?
Deputy Director Williams, are you still on the line?
Yes, ma'am.
What is that new total for the, we just want to make sure we have the right number for the new total, the possibly reduced total.
$231,825.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to call the meeting of the Sentencing Commission back to order. It is, I think we need to do a quick roll call to make sure we have everybody present and a quorum still present. So if you would indicate your presence, Mr. Arascata. Present. Chief Carpenter.
I'm here.
Director Daniels.
Present.
Chair DeRico.
I'm here.
Judge Freeman. Mr. Hicks.
I'm here.
Thank you. As well. All right. Mr. Imlay.
I'm present.
Bye. Love you. Anything else you need?
Miss Brady.
Okay. Here.
Okay.
Here, sorry.
Sheriff Logan.
I'm present, thank you.
Mr. Marsh.
Present.
Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick, are you present? Ms. Mull.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Neighbors. Dr. Neighbors. Mr. Ponder.
Present.
Dr. Salisbury. Mr. Story.
Present.
Assemblywoman Nguyen.
Present.
Has Senator Canizero joined us? Senator Pickard? Vice Chair Callaway?
Here, sir.
And I'm present. Let me circle back, Dr. Neighbors. And Mr. McCormick. All right, we'll mark them present. If they rejoin, we have a quorum. And Dr. Salisbury, you rejoined us, okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right. I wanted to begin by clarifying the numbers so we're dealing with the correct math. The director asked NDOC for a clarification of their total, which is 231,825. I don't know that any further clarification of the P&P number can be provided at this time, although we are aware that there could be an adjustment made with respect to the training component. Host's revised number, Mr. Sherlock, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. What is your revised number with the reduction in travel?
Sorry about that, Mike Sherlock for the record. I show it at $20,045 if we reduce the travel.
Could you repeat it? We keep missing that number. State it again.
$29,945.
Okay, great. And then on the Washoe County District Attorney's request, I appreciated Ms. Freilich's calculation, if I pronounced your name correctly, and I apologize if I didn't. But I wanted to know if you could provide another number for us, and that would be if the position commenced on October the 1st rather than July 1st. What would your number be?
And Justice Hardesty, this is Jennifer Noble. I don't know that Ms. Freilich is already on the call or is it remaining on the call, but I can get that information to you very quickly and perhaps just message Ms. Gonzalez when I have it.
Great. That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll get on that. Thank you, sir.
All right. So I would like to first address a question to the commission. Do you want to include or not include the 78,000 in our determination today, or defer that until July? Because that certainly makes a difference with respect to the extent to which we would be able to fund all of these awards. So let's begin with that question. Because we might want to, for example, defer the training portion of P&P to July, and depending upon the response we get from Ms. Noble, defer the DA's request until July, and then proceed with evaluating the NDOC request, the what I'll call assessment portion and tracking portion of the P&P request, and the post request at this time. I'm just trying to offer a framework for our discussions so that we can make progress and get this into the hopper. The pressure on us to spend the money by September 1 is no longer present. At least that's what we believe, but that doesn't matter. We could start spending this money as soon as we could get it, because obviously the needs are pressing. I personally, and I fully respect the requests we've received, but I think from a priority standpoint, I think we got to address these in the context of the statutory demands that have been placed on the agencies. And so that's why I asked staff to include in the boxes here the statutory demands. Personally, I want to reach that DA's request if we can, because I think that that's going to be a valuable service to all of us and to the whole state. But I also want to go about this a little bit at a time is what I'm recommending to all of you. But I sure want to hear from everybody else and get other ideas and suggestions. So would any of you like to weigh in on how we might approach the threshold question? Do you want to consider the 78 now, which, by the way, we don't actually for sure have. We think we do. That has to be yet approved. But I think Ms. Pierce is expecting that'll occur. But a conservative person might say, let's wait till July before we try to appropriate it. My first question is, do you want to separate the 350 from the 78 in our consideration today? We can approach this in different ways if people have better ideas. That's just my suggestion. Any comments from commission members?
Hi, this is Assemblywoman Rochelle Wynn. I kind of agree with you. I think it's kind of an overwhelming task, and while I'd like to be able to do it all at once, I think that your suggestion that moving some of the people that maybe it is not as pressing and to the July meeting, I think would be appropriate.
Any other suggestions or ideas?
This is Chuck Calloway, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification, I believe the conversation that I had with Victoria or Director Gonzalez a while back was that agencies had to pay these costs up front and then would be reimbursed. Is that still accurate? And if so, in regards to, for example, parole and probation's request or requests that are involving training, would the agency, if it was postponed till July, still front the money up front to do what's necessary with the thought that with the realization they may or may not get it in July, I guess is the question.
Maybe Ms. Pierce would be in a better position to address that question. Ms. Pierce, did you hear the question or do you need it clarified?
I heard the question. We cannot reimburse anything until we have a contract with whatever agency is funded.
But they don't have to spend the money first before they get it, correct?
What happens is it's a reimbursement system, so the money is expended by the agency, and then they submit invoices on a regular basis to CJI for reimbursement.
Yeah, but the problem we talked about before is that they don't have it in their budget. So unless they are assured that they've got it, they can't start spending money from some part of their budget. At least I'm assuming this. That would be problematic, at least for the Supreme Court, unless you have a source that you're assured, you're guaranteed you have that reimbursement. Chief Carpenter, this is in your bailiwick. Can you spend the training money without knowing you're going to get reimbursed?
That's a great question. I'm just trying to get some information from my fiscal staff. My concern is that it was a huge concern, first of all, but now with COVID and the way our budgets are looking, I don't know what money we even have to utilize anymore. So that's a great point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. Yeah, because we don't know, none of the state agencies know the extent to which we're going to sustain a cut. That decision has been made yet. But we know it. We've all tendered projected cuts, and those projected cuts have essentially run everybody out of money. So you don't have money to spend and then get later reimbursed. Barbara, can you weigh in on this? I mean, I don't think the agencies can, for example, spend $75,000 in P&P without knowing that they've got that reimbursement available to them.
Right. I would not recommend doing that. As a former budget analyst, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. What has to happen for us to assure an agency that they have the money for reimbursement is the approval has to be the approval has to come through from BJA, and then CJI has to have a contract with that agency. And until that point, we can't reimburse anything. And so it would be probably best to not expend any money until that's in place. Once the contract is in place, that money is there for reimbursement purposes.
Vice Chair Callaway, does that address your question, or did you have a follow-up?
No, Justice Hardesty, I think that addresses my question and my concern. I mean, if, like was stated, if I'm looking at my own budget, for example, and I have to train officers, for example, on the changes coming to the law and they come into effect July, putting money out up front for potential reimbursement when I don't know that I'm going to get reimbursed is obviously problematic. So for me, that impacts the whole discussion on this issue.
So I'd like to return to the question I posed to the commission before. Do you want to include or not include the $78,000 at this time? With respect to the P&P budget, and to your point, Chuck, I think we have to allocate the full amount that P&P is requesting, even though we might anticipate a reduction if they're able to perform that training online. But the sooner they can get that approved and get their people training, because of the impending effective date of the bill, is pretty important from a priority standpoint. So I think we need to take that into account. And probably Sergeant Rosales will have an answer from UCCI in, I don't know, a week or two or whatever. But waiting till July would just postpone the training period that much longer. So I'm trying to authorize the funds with an expectation there might be a credit. that make sense, Sergeant?
Sergeant Rosales for parole and probation. Yes, sir, and I've already reached out to my contacts with University of Cincinnati to determine if the virtual training of the master class is available for us and the
Great.
cost of that.
So if we do not consider the 78,000, we have 350,000 to appropriate. And what I'm suggesting at this point is that we attempt to fund the 231,825 for NDOC, set aside 75,000 for the parole and probation with the hope that we'll get a credit back once we get that calculated, and set aside 29,945 for post. I think that's right close to the number. We're below 350 slightly, and then we can reevaluate all of this subject again in July with the hopes that we can initiate funding for the Washoe County DA's request in July with this reduced or recalculated amount. I think it's a very valuable service that they could provide. I want to figure out a way to get them some money, and maybe we can also get some additional resources in the meantime. So that's an outline. Any other comments or ideas or different suggestions?
Justice Hardesty, Keith Logan for the record. Not knowing the state's financial, how the reimbursement works, I know from a county's perspective how it sometimes can go, any money that comes back in sometimes does not go directly back to the agency, but rather to the county's general fund. I just would love to see that the protections are in place for the state agencies, that the monies that they are going to expend, or at least allow us to apply for the approval from the grant from our main agencies. And I agree with you for the 3, and then waiting on the Washoe County.
Maybe the fiscal folks with NDOC could address Sheriff Logan's comment. If this were approved under normal circumstances, that grant money, if it came in, it's going to be used for that purpose, right? You're not going to have to divert that into your general fund accounts, are you?
Could be used specifically for.
I'm sorry, could you identify your name and
Franklin, NDOC, for the record. It would be utilized specific for this purpose. It would be utilized specifically for that budget that we created.
Okay. All right. Any further comments, suggestions, or questions?
This is Emily Salisbury for the record. This is tangentially related to funding, just since it was brought up by Chief Carpenter, and I know, of course, all the state agencies are concerned about dealing with COVID, particularly the public safety agencies. I'm sure many are aware of this, but the DOJ, the Department of Justice, through the BJA, has made $850 million available in emergency funding for public safety agencies. I believe the deadline for that, for submitting a proposal to them, is at the end of May or sometime in May. But just as a heads up, in case anybody hadn't seen that, it's obviously related to the funding issue, but not quite related to the grant funding that we're talking about. I just wanted to make sure people knew about it. Thanks.
Thank you for the information and the update. Any other comments or questions? In the interest of our time, the chair would entertain a motion that we fund $231,825 or recommend to CJI and Bureau of Justice Assistance to NDOC. We fund or allocate $75,142.84 to P&P and $29,945 to post. And that we defer the actions on the remaining requests until our July meeting. But I want to make clear that I at least would like to see allocations or fundings made to the Washington County DA's request at some level if we can get it done. That reserves some money for that purpose, and we defer any action on the $78,000. That would be the proposed motion.
So moved. This is Christine Jones Brady.
Is there a second?
This is a second, Dr. Neighbors.
Thank you, Dr. Neighbors. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed to the motion? Is there any person that would like to abstain on the motion?
Judge Scott Freeman is abstaining.
All right. Anyone else? All right. Thank you. The motion passes, and I'm sure that Ms. Gonzalez or Director Gonzalez, and Ms. Pierce will be working closely together with these agencies to start processing these requests as quickly as possible. And thank you, Ms. Pierce, for your assistance and your update on all of this. We really appreciate CGI's support on this implementation effort. And thank you to the staff of the folks who made the request. I know that it's a challenge to put this together, and we appreciate your input. Next, I'd like to open item 6. As you know, we had a fairly lengthy discussion on the SAFER plan at our meeting on April the 13th. That discussion caused me to reach out to CGI to offer some additional input on strategies that have been undertaken in correctional facilities that relate to sort of the safekeeping or the facility protections that might be appropriate in this environment. So CGI has done some additional research at my request and on what departments of correction are doing to keep facilities and people within their institutions safe. So Ms. Pierce, if you wouldn't mind providing your comments on that subject, and this is also on tab 6 of our material. Ms. Pierce?
Thank you. Barbara Pierce for the record. So as just as Hardesty mentioned, we were asked by him and also by different states to basically conduct a scan of what state departments of corrections are doing to release some individuals and also additional measures to reduce the spread of the coronavirus in correctional facilities. I believe he received 2 handouts. The first focuses on how states are working to keep individuals in facilities safe, including staff. The second is a scan of state DOCs and what they're doing or not doing to consider people for early release. Abby Straight on our team will provide a brief overview of the facility safety measures, and then I'll cover the release section.
Good morning. This is Abigail Straight for the record. The first document you all received is entitled Strategies for Keeping Facilities and People in Custody Safe During COVID-19. It shows what we found in a scan of how jurisdictions are modifying the operations of their jails, detention centers, and prisons to respond to COVID-19. We found 12 common practices that states are using, which are listed in that document that you received. It includes examples of how those strategies are looking in practice, and I'll provide a few examples from each of those strategies as a review. Before I get into that, as a note, this document and the overview I'm about to give are not meant to be an exhaustive list of practices across the country. The jurisdictions noted in parentheses on that document you received are simply examples. In some cases, many jurisdictions are implementing a certain practice. And in addition, practices are changing frequently as the COVID situation evolves, so details may be evolving as well. So the document, therefore, isn't meant to be exhaustive, but to provide examples of the wide range of approaches corrections agencies are taking. So just to real quick do a summary of the document, the first strategy you'll see on there is developing a pandemic plan or protocol. Many DOCs have modified their existing plans for responding to the flu or other pandemics to include CDC guidance on COVID-19. And as an example, Washington State developed PPE protocols for patients in isolation and for staff interactions with those patients. The second strategy is educating staff, inmates, and the public. As an example of this, Louisiana has created educational materials for incarcerated individuals, including frequently asked questions and answers about COVID-19 in an attempt to help educate people. The third strategy is restricting movement. Several states, including Arizona, Alaska, and California, have suspended the transfer of incarcerated people between complexes and facilities. Fourth is reducing the cost of communication for incarcerated people. Since many facilities have suspended in-person visitation to restrict the spread of COVID-19, some facilities have waived fees for other types of communication, like video calls, phone calls, or mail. And as an example of that, Utah is providing 10 free 15-minute phone calls to each person in prison per week. The fifth strategy is eliminating medical copays for incarcerated people. There are two major strategies to implement this, either through one, suspending all copays, and we identified 11 states doing this, or by suspending copays for respiratory, flu-related, or COVID symptoms. And we identified 26 states doing that strategy. Number 6 on that document is providing services and supplies at no cost. An example of that, Mississippi is installing hand sanitizing stations at their facilities, and as another example, Pennsylvania is providing materials for incarcerated individuals to use to clean their cells daily. Number 7 is screening of incarcerated people. The Bureau of Prisons, as well as several states, are screening all incarcerated people arriving at or departing from a facility according to CDC guidelines, which includes a temperature reading, inquiring about recent travel, and inquiring about any contact that person may have had with people who have experienced symptoms consistent with COVID-19. And another example of that is that Ohio has been conducting mass testing at 2 of their facilities and testing all incarcerated people, even those who are not displaying symptoms. Number 8 on that document is screening of staff and vendors. Again, the Bureau of Prisons, along with several other states, are screening all staff and vendors arriving at facilities according to CDC guidelines. Number 9 is isolating and treating suspected cases of COVID-19. As an example of that practice, Minnesota created a step-down area per CDC guidance for incarcerated individuals who had COVID-19 symptoms that had since been resolved. Individuals in that circumstance will stay in that step-down area for 7 days before then re-entering the general population. Number 10 is ensuring the cleanliness of facilities and transport vehicles. As an example of that, Missouri has designated a point person at each facility to ensure adherence to a sanitizing schedule and ensure hygiene and cleaning supplies are readily available. And number 11 is practicing social distancing while providing programming. Several states, including Arizona, California, and Minnesota, are providing in-cell programming or distance learning. This can be provided in different ways, maybe through electronic devices or printed worksheets or self-guided treatment activities. And then finally, the last strategy we identified is collaborating with the National Guard for additional support. Ohio and Kansas have been working with the National Guard to provide healthcare operations due to staffing shortages at correctional facilities. So that's a very quick review of that. There are further examples on that document you received, and you feel free to let us know if there is further detail you would like on any of those practices. And with that, I'll turn it over to Barbara to review the second COVID-19 related document you received from us.
Maybe before we get into that second document, if you don't mind, Ms. Straight, I'd like to invite members of the commission that may have questions about these strategies to weigh in at this point. I know that we have later in the agenda a continuing discussion of the SAFER plan, but I wanted to add this additional research to the context of our discussions. Are there any questions of commission members for Ms. Straight? All right, hearing and seeing none, we'll move on to Ms. Pierce. Thank you, Ms. Straight, for your help.
Great, thank you. Barbara Pierce for the record. So the document that you received that's entitled State Correction Systems Release Responses shows what we found in a scan of 50 states. It's important to note that that scan was done leading up to April 22nd. It won't be any surprise to you that things within the states are changing daily, and so this is not up to date as of today. You have the document, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I did want to just generally talk about 8 categories that really is encompassed within that 50-state scan. The general categories are just straight early release, compassionate release, release of individuals serving sanctions for supervision violations, release consideration for people who are serving prison time on technical violations of supervision, furloughs, home confinement, and expedited parole processes, and commutation of the remainder of sentences. So I'll just provide a few examples. I don't want to bore you with it. So in terms of early release, Georgia, for example, is looking at possibly releasing people who are in on nonviolent offenses and within 180 days of their prison sentence ending or their parole date. Maryland, on the other hand, has an executive order from the governor allowing the release of people who are eligible for release within 4 months at high risk of COVID complications. It excludes sex offenders, and people must be showing no signs of COVID. In terms of compassionate release, Ohio is looking at people who are over 60 who have an underlying medical condition. Arkansas is looking at nonviolent, non-sex offenders within 6 months of release. West Virginia and New York State are looking at possible releases of those who are in prison serving sanctions for parole violations. States like New York and Massachusetts are considering releases for people who are serving time for technical violations of supervision. The state of Louisiana is using their furlough authority to look at 2 different populations. The first is a medical population, so basically people who have an underlying health condition, they're in on nonviolent, non-sex offenses, they're within 6 months of release, and they have proof that they have housing to go to. The second population are state inmates who are housed in local jails. In Louisiana, more than half of the population of state inmates are held in those jails. So basically, they're looking at the population of people who have served at least 6 months, people whose release date is within 6 months, nonviolent, non-sex offenses, and again, proof of housing. Excuse me. The interesting part about what Louisiana is doing with these furloughs is who's making the decisions on the releases. So basically, they've formed a panel of 6 representatives. The Secretary of the Department of Corrections is on that. The Director of Probation and Parole, the Executive Director of the Pardon and Parole Board, a Victims Advocate who's appointed by the Governor, the Sheriff's Association Executive Director, and the Executive Director of the DA's Association. There's a couple other states that are looking at furloughs very differently, such as West Virginia extending furloughs from, they're extending weekend furloughs to a 2-week period. New Hampshire is looking at administrative home confinement for people who are medically frail. They also have to be nearing a release date. They have to have no assaults while incarcerated, no history of revocation from a previous home confinement status, and they cannot have been convicted of murder, manslaughter, felony sexual assault, first and second degree assault, robbery, escape, and aggravated DUI. In terms of expediting parole processes, some states are doing this through expediting the release of people who are in their prisons who have already been approved for parole. Some are using emergency orders or other emergency powers to expedite parole consideration for those within a certain time period of their parole eligibility date. And finally, in terms of commutation of sentences, New Mexico is looking to commute the remainder of sentences for people whose release date is no more than a month away. They have a parole plan in place, and they're not convicted of certain offenses such as felony DUI, sex offenses, and they're not serving time for domestic violence, assault on a peace officer, or offense with a firearm enhancement. So there's just a couple of examples. One other note on that document, the light blue shaded rows are the states that, as of the 22nd, showed no indication that they were going to do any early releases or consider any. 17 states fell into that category. So just to wrap up, I covered a lot of random details, but I think it's important to note that every state's sort of taking a very unique approach based on their needs. They're also developing these plans based on, obviously, what every state would be doing, a review of statutory authority of different agencies and entities. They're reviewing any emergency powers that agencies might have. They're using executive orders. They're definitely collaborating amongst criminal justice partners, and they're really taking a deep dive into their data, things like determining who's nearing release, what does the medically fragile population look like, and data such as that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Pierce. Appreciate your taking the time to compile this for us on short notice. Are there any questions of Ms. Pierce or her on her presentation?
This is Emily Salisbury. Thanks so much for that information. I guess I just have another question about the states that are releasing certain incarcerated people or going through that process. Did you all come across any specific plan for testing them for COVID-19, even if they're asymptomatic, prior to their release? I've seen a number of media stories, certainly from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, where the process can be quite cumbersome in terms of trying to quarantine people before they get released, including, if one person gets sick in the group of the quarantined inmates, then everybody has to start over. I believe a federal judge has weighed in on this. So I'm just wondering if you've come across any best practices in terms of if a determination is made to release in these certain states, what, not only who to release, but what is the plan?
Mm-hmm. So I think Maryland is one example. Their release mechanisms include that that testing prior to release. I believe it's testing. I'll have to verify that, but it's they're not going to release anyone with symptoms. So yes, they're either screening or testing people. There's also I forget which state it is. It might be Maryland again. But when they're looking at what housing options somebody has when they're considering release, they're determining at least one state is determining whether the that housing would allow a space for a 14-day quarantine.
Thank you. And I believe there's some states that are using hotels, potentially housing for people who are incarcerated who are releasing. I think Connecticut may be one of those states. Did you see any of that in your search?
That did not come up necessarily in this search, but I do recall reading articles where certain jurisdictions are considering the use of hotels. I believe New York City was looking at that option.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Ms. Pierce?
Justice Hardesty, I have a couple questions. This is Chris Hicks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hicks. Go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Pierce, I just have a couple questions. Are you guys taking any particular position, or is this just kind of a fact finding? Let's present the commission what different states are doing.
I think so. I think I caught the full part of your question, but you cut out for a second. We have no stance on this. This is literally a fact-finding thing. It's to show, and the other state that requested this information also was interested in literally seeing like what factors, for example, states are considering.
This was a research project, Mr. Hicks, I asked them to do.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the SAFER plan that's been mentioned?
Yeah, so that was covered in the last meeting. I don't have it sitting in front of me, though.
But that's okay. I'll move on from that. What's kind of been going on in my head, and I'm interested in the position of CJI on this, because we've worked so well with you, the state of Nevada, and the Sentencing Commission for the last 2 years. And for me to paraphrase, please correct me if I'm wrong, but largely the philosophy of what you came in to help us with and what AB 236 was in place to fix is this kind of reinvestment idea, essentially withdrawing money from prison capacity and using it in better services that will help reduce recidivism. Is that a fair, accurate depiction of, in a very general sense, of what we're trying to do in Nevada?
So basically, yes. So when the state commits to doing justice reinvestment, they are committing to a policy development process, an implementation process, and some type of reinvestment. Yeah, and then we are the provider to help with that.
Thank you. And I recall one statistic that you guys had discovered when you were doing the fact finding of our prison population, and that was that nearly 30% of Nevada prison discharges fail in the community within 3 years of release. It's in essence recidivism, a very high recidivism rate. Is that fair?
I'm not familiar with that statistic because I don't have it right here, but I trust that you pulled it from a report that was done.
I pulled it right from your website.
Excellent, thank you.
And I'm trying to get around to my point, but I have to get there. So again, on your experience, your training, your education, what are the primary causes of recidivism? What you find, for example, here, you found lack of transitional housing, lack of reentry programs, lack of behavioral counseling, lack of substance abuse counseling, things of that manner.
Right. And then there's also just the other types of risk factors that are found on the NRES, for example, that are characteristics of the individual, such as, there's a lot of things that lead to risk to reoffend. Sure. So, yes. So there's like these societal factors, obviously, but then there's also that focus on the risk factors.
And so what I'm concerned about, and others are concerned about, it was brought up in our last meeting, is when we look at Nevada right now, we have a housing crisis that's been around for a long time. We have a very large homeless population. And now we have 22% of our workforce applying for unemployment. Our budgets, our state budgets and county budgets are being drastically reduced. In turn, services for arrestees or parolees or inmates could get drastically cut too. We know what happens to the prison budget when the state budget gets slashed. What I'm interested in is, does CJI have any concerns about, for example, releasing hundreds of inmates early into a system that, one, can't support them, and into a state that, two, has all these risk factors, no reentry programs, homelessness, unemployment, housing crisis, and what to me, it's setting them up for failure. I've heard the word compassionate release. To me, it's uncompassionate release, because what are they to do? And then in turn, and the next step is then what happens to public safety? And so I know CJI is very reasoned in their reinvestment philosophies, and I've always appreciated that. But my question is you guys had to have discussed this. What is the concern about a mass release of people into a system that can't support them, and in turn into a state that doesn't have the resources right now to help them? Sorry that took so long to get to.
All right, there was a lot there. But so to me, I'll just say from the implementation perspective in terms of assisting the commission and others in the state on implementation, to me, I have a lot of concerns related to COVID that are definitely related to economic, like personal concerns about all of that. I think it's the job of the commission, though, to be talking this through. I don't know that our opinion or stance matters here, to be honest with you. I think, so the implementation date is coming up July 1, and I feel like there are huge discussions to be had about what is the state going to invest in moving forward. And yes, there's an economic crisis coming or here. So I don't really feel like it's our role as an implementation technical assistance provider to sort of weigh in. I think there's always concerns about releasing people. There's also concerns about keeping people in prison for different reasons. It's kind of a non-answer, but I don't feel like it's our role to be sort of providing that.
Fair enough.
This is Darren, Emily, if I can comment.
Can I just finish my last question, Darren?
Sure.
Go ahead, Mr. Hicks, and then we'll go to Mr. Emily.
Thank you. Of the 50 states you looked at, how many states had no outbreaks in their prisons when you did this evaluation?
So we did not have time to cross-reference the extent of the COVID issue inside facilities and compare it to these practices.
Mr. Emily, I think you had a question.
I have a couple of comments. One is the issue that we are dealing with right now is COVID-19 and trying to minimize the potential for an outbreak in the prison. Last time we met, the question was asked, how many inmates have actually been tested for COVID-19? The answer was 0. And so at this point, I don't know if that's changed, but we don't know how many people at NDOC have COVID-19. Whether there's any or whether there's 100, we have no idea. But that's one of the issues we're addressing right now. We can't keep people in prison just because of an economic downturn. If we're looking at the SAFER plan, many of the categories that the people are falling into are people that have already been granted parole and are just waiting for release, or people that have a plan in place, or they can get a plan in place. And so we're not talking about violent offenders at all, so that's not even on the table. But we're talking about people that have the ability to have a plan in place or already have a plan in place to deal with COVID-19 right now. Some of the other questions dealt with a systemic issue that we're having with people being paroled and not having resources to. That's a separate issue from dealing right now with how is Nevada going to respond to COVID-19 and the potential spread. And so I completely stand by the SAFER plan. I think it's common sense. I think it's realistic in light of what we're facing to prevent an outbreak. Because like I said, we don't know whether there's an outbreak going on now, because last information we received, 0 inmates had been tested.
Well, what I'd like, I know that people have varying viewpoints on all of this, but I wanted to provide, I think the commission should be operating on factual information and research data. So my objective in having the presentation from CJI was to take advantage of their resources to do a summary, and it was quick. We only had a week or two to week and a half turnaround to be able to do this for us, but I wanted this commission to be able to get some information from other jurisdictions. I also think that our decisions need to be fact-based, and the facts are changing. So unless somebody has a further question of Ms. Pierce on her presentation, I'd like to move to agenda item number 7A and get some follow-up information from the Department of Corrections, the Division of Parole and Probation, and as appropriate or needed from the Parole Commission, both follow-up information that was requested in our last meeting and current data from what we heard on April the 13th. So first, are there any other questions of Ms. Pierce on her presentation? All right, then let's move to item 7. I introduced that subject, but I'll repeat. On April 13th, the Sentencing Commission heard presentations from the Department of Corrections, the Division of Parole and Probation, and the Board of Parole Commissioners about the impact of COVID-19 on their institutions, their agencies, their staff, and those they supervise or have in their custody. I wanted to get updates, so we're operating with current, accurate information from each of the 3 agencies, and then we'll move on to further discussion as necessary concerning the SAFER plan, the strategies that Ms. Straight talked about, and then whether or if the board intends, the commission, I should say, wants to offer any recommendations to anybody on the subject of releases. So let's start. Director Daniels, are you with us and on the phone and ready to proceed?
I am with you and I'm on the phone.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon, Chair Hardesty and Commission members. For the record, my name is Charles Daniels, Director of the Nevada Department of Corrections. I would like to take this opportunity to formally update a statement I made during the April 13th Sentencing Commission meeting. During the meeting, I was specifically asked how many inmates had been tested for COVID-19, to which I responded, none. The information I provided was outdated and did not accurately reflect the data I had available to me. NDOC started with 158 CDC-approved COVID-19 test swabs. To date, NDOC has tested 39 inmates using 11 swabs and 30 rapid cassettes, of which all were determined negative. NDOC received an additional 400 test kits on April 24th and now have 547 remaining tests. Since the onset of Governor Sisolak's emergency declaration on March 12th, I immediately transitioned NDOC into modified operations by restricting visitation on March 15th and restricting non-DOC employees' access on March 16th. To further prepare NDOC's response to the pandemic, we activated emergency operations centers at every major facility and began logging all COVID-19 activities and incidents, to include possible COVID-19 exposures of staff and offenders. We immediately suspended visitation and all non-DOC employees, as well as implemented both screening and transportation protocols. We also created inmate sanitation teams utilizing 10% bleach solution to clean all common areas prior to and after meals. The sanitation teams clean at least twice daily and as needed. This 10% bleach solution is also available for checkout upon request to inmates for cleaning and sanitizing their cells. We provide informational briefings twice weekly to all staff and inmates in which we provide updates regarding our COVID-19 related protocols and procedures. Additionally, we have mandated all staff within secured facilities wear a mask at all times. Further, we implemented entrance screening procedures immediately following Governor Sisolak's emergency regulations declaration. To date, our protocols and procedures have been successful in mitigating the spread of COVID-19. Currently, we have 0 confirmed inmate cases of COVID-19. To date, 11 staff tested positive for COVID-19. Each of those staff were instructed to self-quarantine and were not authorized to return to duty until cleared by their medical provider and NDOC's medical director. To date, one of the staff members who tested positive has been cleared and has returned to work. That concludes my information.
Okay, are there any members of the commission that have any questions for the director?
Chair Hardesty, Todd Sawyer with the ACLU.
All right, Mr. Story goes first, and then we'll proceed to the next person.
Yes, thank you, Director Daniels. I have a question about the tests that were run. You said there's 39 swab tests that were run and 31 rapid tests. Could you speak to the symptoms and the reasons that those 2 types of tests were utilized, and what the findings were regarding each of those different style tests?
The type of test that was used was determined by our medical team. I believe that was also cleared through our medical director. In addition to that, if you did the math, you'll notice that we used a few more tests on inmates than that we had tested, because several inmates tested twice.
So what were the symptoms that caused the tests to be conducted on those inmates?
This is Michael Minev, Medical Director, NDOC, for the record. We use 3 cardinal symptoms to screen inmates and staff for COVID-19. That includes a temperature of 100.4 or above, dry cough, or shortness of breath. After discussions with our Chief Medical Officer of DHHS, Dr. Azam, his last name is spelled A-Z-Z-A-M, we have since broadened those criteria to any upper or lower respiratory tract symptoms. We have a very low threshold for testing either our inmates or our staff for COVID-19 because of the risk of individuals carrying the infection with mild symptoms. Also, individuals may also carry COVID-19 and be asymptomatic. So we have a very low threshold, but we try to use the 3 cardinal symptoms as our main symptoms to look for, but any upper or low respiratory type of symptoms, runny nose, cough, sore throat, any flu-like symptoms, muscle aches, chills, anything of that sort is a criteria for testing. I have directed all the medical providers at all of our facilities to call me 24/7 if there's any inmates that have any of those symptoms. We discuss the case real time, and we make a decision on whether to test based on those criteria.
Thank you. I know you referenced the 3 cardinal symptoms, but I believe that it was just this week that the CDC revised their list of symptoms to include additional upper lower GI issues, digestive issues as well. Some people are talking about cold feet. So the range of symptoms has expanded. I'm curious if you could revise the list, update it to reflect what that list of the CDC that's been revised.
Correct. We have not revised that as yet, but the providers at our facilities are aware, and I have made it known to them that if there's anything suspicious to call me so that we can discuss the case, decide on testing.
Got
it. Somebody else wanted to ask the director a question?
I have a question. This is Assemblywoman Rochelle Wynn. You had indicated that you had sanitation teams that were doing that. Who's making up those sanitation teams, and what kind of like PPE and what type of protection do they have? Is that like staff? Is that inmates? Who is that team?
The teams are created at each individual facility in conjunction with our medical staff in terms of guidance and so on. But typically in the housing units and where the inmates live and where they work, the inmates are provided with the equipment to go ahead and sanitize, and they are also supervised under what we call direct supervision by staff while they're doing all the cleaning. So the supplies are handed out to the inmates by staff. The supplies are monitored, and they move forward on a regular basis, and they have individualized teams.
And then my other question is a follow-up to, you had indicated that there were 11 staff that had tested positive and they were told to quarantine for 14 days and then get medical clearance before they could return to work. What type of process do you have in place to track their their interaction with the individuals that are incarcerated in those facilities that they work? And were you doing any kind of testing of the people that they came in contact, even if they didn't exhibit symptoms, as they could have been carriers?
This is Michael Minev, Medical Director, NDOC, for the record. I work in closely with our infection control nurse, Miguel Ferrero, and our Chief of Nursing, Therese Wickham. Suspected COVID cases are emailed to all three of us. We review the cases and determine whether an individual needs to be on quarantine, what's the amount of time, what testing is required. Your question, if you could repeat again, was that you had a question about individuals that had tested positive. What was the follow-up? Is that correct?
What was that? I didn't catch the last part. It cut out.
I just wanted to understand your question. You had a question in regards to the individuals that had our staff that tested positive. What is our follow-up procedure? Is that what you were asking?
Well, let's say you have a correction officer who tests positive. You tell them to self-quarantine until they get medical approval to come back. I think you indicated that one of the 11 has already come back back to work. Is that right? That's correct. Okay. And then, sorry, I don't want to cross-examine you. I know it's natural, a tendency to do that. So I guess my question is, let's say you have a correction officer that we later learned was positive, and they were in a module with 20 other incarcerated individuals, and none of those individuals are symptomatic, but they obviously had contact with that person who was, and now they're potentially carriers spreading. Is there any process in place to test those individuals?
Yes.
Or are they all being quarantined?
Again, this is Michael Minev, Medical Director, NDOC, for the record. What we do is we find out the individual who tested positive. We find all the contacts, and we do that in conjunction with custody, who is able to give us information in terms of who the individual is in contact with. And we have a list of those individuals, and we monitor those individuals for any symptoms over a period of 14 days. Those individuals, if they had a direct contact with someone who tested positive, staff go home for 14 days, and we keep track of those individuals. If they develop any symptoms, they are referred for testing. And inmates, we had incidents where we had to quarantine inmates for 14 days to closely follow them, and if they developed any symptoms, we would also proceed with testing. We have been trying our best to reserve our COVID-19 tests for only our inmates because of the limited supply in the community. However, we are considering testing our employees who are currently on quarantine before they return. I have had extensive discussions with Dr. Azam, the Chief Medical Officer of DHHS, in regards to this. I feel most confident if our employees return back to work after 2 negative COVID-19 tests, as long as they are separated by at least 48 hours. There are some instances where outside providers have cleared our staff to return to work, and I have not allowed them to come back to work because I want to make sure that they have 2 negative COVID-19 tests and be absolutely sure that they're negative before they return to work.
Oh, I have more questions. My other question, and this might also include some of the, like maybe Vice Chair Callaway can, coordinate in your efforts in answering this question. For example, like we learned at the conclusion of the last meeting that there were positive tests for active COVID-19 at the Clark County Detention Center. And obviously, once people are sentenced, they are transported from those local detention centers to your facilities. I know that there is, you have kind of your classification when people arrive in the prison system. How are you coordinating that track and trace kind of mentality between the local jails and the prison when you get newly incarcerated or sentenced individuals?
This is Director Daniels for the record. We communicate regularly with the folks at the county jail. We know who's coming in advance. We ask them to share any information that's medically related in advance, and then upon their arrival, we quarantine those inmates from 14 up to 20 days in an isolation unit. While there, they are obviously medically observed, and if there are any issues whatsoever, we will typically be made aware of it while those inmates are in the intake area. What you must also remember is that all the inmates eventually from Clark County Detention Center will start out at High Desert State Prison in their quarantine unit. And at some point in time, they may not be designated there to serve them time, but they will go through the quarantine period while at our High Desert State Prison. Up north, that would also, this is Director Daniels for the record. For our northern facility, we have Northern Nevada Correctional Center, where we also allow inmates to come from the county jail up there to our facility.
I guess I also have concerns. I mean, there's obvious concerns, with people that are incarcerated, but as far as staff, the 11, I know previously there were 6 and they had all tested on their own with their own medical doctors. And you said you're trying to reserve most of your testing kits for the people that are incarcerated, potentially. So have the other remaining of the other 11 that have tested positive, are they all doing that on their own as well?
This is Michael Minna, Medical Director, NDOC, for the record. What we are now coordinating is coordinating a way in which the 10 individuals, staff members that have tested positive, we will have them come to our Casa Grande transitional housing. And what we will do is we will have a nurse that will perform swab tests. And what we will do to make sure that we get 2 tests within at least a 48-hour period of time. And only after those 2 are negative would the individual be cleared to come back to work.
Thank you.
Anyone else with questions for the director at this point?
For the record, this is Kimberly Mull.
Yes, Ms. Mull.
Not so much a question. So Director Daniels offered the opportunity to come tour some of the facilities this last Friday. And I know that John Ponder and I both took up that opportunity to visit the High Desert prison here in Clark County. And I just wanted to share, if possible, a little bit about that experience and what at least I observed, and maybe that might help answer some questions as well. Is that okay here, or?
Of course.
Okay. So I want to start with the fact that I am a very high risk individual for COVID. I, not even a few years ago, was hospitalized in ICU for 11 days and had surgery on my lungs. I have a lung disease. But I felt like it was very important for some of the members on this committee to personally go and see with our own eyes what was happening. I am the daughter of a retired correctional officer, but I also have more family members than I can count incarcerated, including a brother who's out now, but was originally charged with murder. So it's a situation where I very much care about what's going on, and I think that the families of these individuals very much care what's going on. And so going into it, the first thing you do when you walk in is they have a station set up where the medical staff record your temperature, which honestly I was ecstatic about, because for the last 6 weeks I've been unable to find a thermometer in Las Vegas to buy. But they record your temperature, and then they ask you a series of questions as far as how do you currently feel, your recent engagement with other individuals, do you have any concerns relating to being exposed to COVID, etc. And then you're offered mask and hand sanitizer, I believe, all of which were made there through the prison system. At this time, there were several employees in this, I guess, the waiting area to go into the visitation area. And so I did talk to some of the employees, including several correctional officers, to ask them how they were feeling, what their experience was, and how they felt regarding the policies and procedures that were in place. And each member reiterated his or her belief in the safety procedures that are being implemented. They said, and multiple of them stated that they had very low numbers of staff calling in, and that basically they were very appreciative of still having a job in these times, more than anything. Then we were led down to a building, I don't know what the actual term is, where there's, I believe they're called pods, and we got to observe 8 separate, what they're calling COVID town halls. By my count, I would approximate about 120 individuals, inmates, were in these 2 pods and divvied up in these meetings that we got to observe. In these meetings, the warden essentially read off what the current status was of what they were implementing or experiencing for COVID, such as here are our policies, do you have any questions? And there were several individuals who asked questions. For the most part, I think John and I talked about a lot of what we saw as individuals nodding in agreement with what was being said, but there were some individuals who were taking notes and had questions to ask. These ranged in asking about if there was going to be early release or compassionate release. Others were asking about the ability to get masks, and why they couldn't have their own hand sanitizer. At this point, from our experience, they were allowed to ask for hand sanitizer and get hand sanitizer, but they're not allowed to have their own, I believe because some individuals were taking advantage of that, being alcohol-based. There were questions about, really the main questions I noticed were, they were concerned about what was happening to the individuals coming in from county jail. So they were told how they're quarantining them and keeping them for a minimum of 14 and an average of 20 days. And that seemed to comfort several of them that were worried about that. But the main thing that I saw expressed from the individuals that were incarcerated was they wanted to know how their families were doing on the outside. They wanted to know what was happening out in the outside, I guess, world, and asking about, if they could have more communication with them, if they could have more ability to have phone calls and things to that extent, because really it seemed like they were more worried about their families and friends than they were about themselves. I'm not saying that's universal. I'm just saying that's what I experienced from there, from watching and interacting with them. Many of them were worried about the lack of food and housing and jobs for their family members, and really wanted to be able to find out more about that, to which the warden and Director Daniels tried to express what was happening in our communities, and to that point. The other main things that were questioned and asked were why guards only had to wear masks at that time. It sounds like it may have changed. At that time, they only had to wear masks if they were within 6 feet of an inmate. And so there were questions asked about that, and then also asked about if guards could wear gloves, because some of the inmates were concerned about guards touching things that then the inmates had to touch, like microwave handles or surfaces, and wanting to know why there weren't gloves being implemented. To which they talked a little bit about that, and then also talked about, sometimes it's showing that washing your hands is more effective than wearing gloves because you're getting a false insecurity, but trying to answer those questions. And so overall, it was very impressive. From my standpoint, I was very impressed by what I was seeing, and by what I experienced and listened. There was plenty of room for the individuals that were incarcerated to practice social distancing and to keep far from each other. But within those 120 or so individuals that attended these 8 town halls, only 2 I saw actually distanced themselves from everybody else. Everybody else sat at tables nearby with little groups, and there were several tables that were left open and available for individuals to spread apart at if they had chosen to, but they did not choose to do that. And so for the most part, from my experience, most individuals that at least I got to observe and interact with seemed comfortable, as you can be in that situation, and were more concerned about their family members and people on the outside than they were about what was happening, or I guess what the possibility of could happen to them was. And I know Mr. Ponder probably can add to that. That I think it's just important for us to recognize that because they're at this point have not had a large outbreak, because we were the first state to stop visitation, because we were the first state to limit movement, I guess, as far as I can tell, in these areas, and to keep individuals in smaller, like family-like units, where when they do come out, when they do interact, it's with the same group of individuals within their pod. And so it's very similar to, I guess, here on the outside, where we're confining ourselves with our family members. It seems to have that same kind of environment. So is it perfect? Absolutely not. Is anything 100% assured? Absolutely not. But from my experience and from what I saw, I've been very impressed by Director Daniels and what was being implemented. And I felt very safe, even with as high risk as I am, going into that environment and being able to observe it. So I just wanted to put that on the record and make sure that that not only that I thank Director Daniels and his staff for what they're doing, but also to recognize that I think in many ways because of the things we did first, we should be recognized nationally as a leader with what our department did and what they are still trying to do to mitigate that exposure and the possible cost.
Thank you, Ms. Mull. I did want to extend my thanks to Director Daniels and his staff for inviting members of the commission, following up on his invitation for members of the commission to enter the prison facilities and witness their town hall meetings and As Ms. Mull indicated, she took advantage of that opportunity and had time to do it. And I want to thank you, Ms. Mull, for doing that with respect to your responsibilities on the commission. That's very helpful insight. Mr. Ponder, while we're on the subject, do you want to supplement that or offer any other comments?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Hardesty. And for the record, John Ponder, and I want to extend a huge thank you to Director Daniels as well for the invitation for the commission to come in. I greatly appreciate your transparency. What I appreciate even more is the extreme professionalism that I experienced from the time we walked into the institution to the level of information that was being conveyed to the inmates. I think you did a phenomenal job at keeping them informative of what's going on, not only inside the facility, but being able to bring them up to date, bring them up to speed with things that are taking place on the outside. I was really even more impressed, for lack of a better word, at the receptiveness of the inmates. As Ms. Small indicated, it was 8 different groups of inmates that we had the chance to go through this town hall, but them being receptive to it and the quality of the questions that they were asking and their response to those questions was just very, very, I was very, very, very impressed. So Director Daniels, thank you for that, and appreciate the opportunity for us to be able to come inside so that we can, see it for ourselves.
Are there any other questions of Director Daniels before I ask Chief Carpenter to give us an update on the Parole and Probation Division?
I have a couple questions, Chair Hardesty. This is Chris Hicks.
Sure, go ahead, Mr. Hicks.
Thank you. Director Daniels, today, what's the population of the Department of Corrections?
This is Director Daniels for the record. We have 12,123 inmates.
And if you don't have these numbers, fine. I'm just curious if you guys have done any kind of breakdowns into looking at your population relative to COVID concerns. How many of those inmates are over 65, if you know?
I can look that up for you, but I do not know off the top of my head.
Okay. Do you know, have you guys done any kind of analysis based on CDC guidelines of how many of your inmates may fit the category of those that are a higher risk, such as people with chronic lung disease, severe asthma, serious heart conditions, immune compromise due to cancer treatment, organ transplantation, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, any of that? Have you broken that down at all to kind of get a snapshot of what that population looks like?
This is Michael Minev, Medical Director for NDOC. We are aware of those individuals with those conditions, but I do not have an exact number of those individuals.
Do you have a ballpark?
I don't, but I can get those numbers for you.
Thank you. How many of your 12,123 are on house arrest?
This is Director Daniels for the record. I don't believe we have any inmates for house arrest.
Okay. Other question, the CJI put together this nice packet of strategy for keeping facilities and people in custody safe. And it was a little bit like a rerun for us because it seemed to me you guys are doing most of what was suggested in here. Is that fair?
That would be an accurate assessment, and we're doing some additional things. I just gave you the highlights.
Thank you. And then my last question is, I've been looking at the CDC guidelines, and they say social distancing, avoiding immediate face-to-face contact is one of the best ways to avoid the transmission of COVID. Within your prisons, how many people would have to be released in order for you to actually operate with the 6-foot social distancing?
This is Director Daniels. For the record, I have done no such study. However, understanding how that works, we implemented controlled movement very early on in the process, in which we only would allow maybe a quarter of a housing unit out at a time to do anything. And those individuals typically have stayed together the entire time since we've started. So if we did happen to have some type of positive, we could easily trace back all the inmates that had access to the individual staff member, because realities of it all would probably be brought in by a staff member. And we've been very aggressive at our front entrance. That's where we draw our firewall. It's certainly not perfect, and if anyone tells you they have a perfect system, I don't know what else to tell you, but we don't. But I tell you what, through our medical assessment at the front, every step we're entering, we do a pretty good job of doing a primary and a secondary assessment if necessary. And because of that controlled movement, when the inmates are out of their pods, though, they can practice controlled movement, social distancing while inside of their pods for the most part.
Thank you. Like Ms. Mole and others have said, I commend you immensely for the steps you all took. We've seen other states with massive outbreaks. I've done a fair amount of looking into it over the last couple days, and it's quite commendable, sir. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the comment, and I appreciate the comments of Ms. Mole and Mr. Ponder, but I would be remiss if I were to tell you this wasn't anything more than my staff, to include my medical staff, my custody staff, and so on, just doing a tremendous job. We have staff fighting to come to work versus trying to find a way to be home, yet we all have the same issues that anyone else out in society has, but I have